delightful conversation. So maybe there's really no reason to have an episode today. I mean, we've talked about history, we've talked about drinking, we've talked about Taylor Swift, we talked about the sex appeal of Hozier. I mean, there's really no other topics as far as I could, as far as my little brain can handle. But we'll see what happens. I guess we'll see what goes. I have a very interesting, different drink today, Varsha, that I'm going to talk about. So.
Oh, I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be that excited, but.
Yeah, I don't know everybody's proper introductions, but I'll try. Just to introduce everybody for people who are joining us, we have Jen Binnis, Jeremy Salpeed, and PH Jones on the show with us today. They are the moderators of Reddit/Ask Historians. And it's really cool because the thing about Reddit is I'm slightly afraid of Reddit. So whenever I try to use it, I get overwhelmed by Reddit. I think the reason I get overwhelmed is it's a lot of organized chaos, but I don't like the chaos part of it. So I'm really excited to hear about, what you guys do. And you guys are all historians. As we talked about before we started recording, Jen works on, I just remembered this, history of education in the US. And Jeremy works on 19th century China and the Qing Empire, pretty sure. And P.H. Jones works on dueling in North America and England, which I think is amazing.
Can you imagine how well we would do this show, Varsha, if we tried?
It would be, listen, it would be the next Netflix special. I promise you. Like the podcast networks would pick us up.
The podcast network. That's yes. We have a face for radio, as they say. So. Yes. And I think, the thing, probably some of our viewers aren't familiar with Reddit generally, but Ask Historians maybe specifically, and I hope people are, is that, there's over 1 million subscribers just to this subreddit. They host guests, which is how I got introduced to some of these guys initially when David and I published The Bright Ages. And they have really masterful conversations, and I've been a lurker there for a really long time and trying to answer some questions every once in a while, but the questions are great. So I think, and that's one of the questions I want to ask you guys, but before we get going, we do have to ask you the one question that we ask everybody. What are y'all drinking? And Jen, so I'm gonna ask you first, what are you drinking tonight?
In honor of my brother-in-law who lives in New Zealand, it is a New Zealand Sauv Blanc. I don't remember which one it is, but it's a New Zealand Sauv Blanc.
They have some nice wines down there.
They do.
On their tiny little island that I can make fun of. I have some good friends who are from New Zealand, and so I'm going to make fun of it in some way. I call it Australia every once in a while, or Little Australia. So they don't like that. They don't like it at all. So.
Yeah, I don't drink wine often, but whenever I've had wine, I've always had white wine, and the best wine I ever had was at a lunch with my now advisor who's from New Zealand, and she had a New Zealand wine, and it was real good. They make good white wine.
Nice.
Don't say she's from Little Australia. She's not going to like that. Take it from me. So anyway,
I'm too afraid of her to say that. There's no way I would say that to Jeremy.
If you're not terrified of your dissertation advisor, even if it's unjustified, then what are you even doing? So so Jeremy, what are you drinking this week?
So because I'm one of these sort of youthful teetotal types, I'm going with a Hong Kong classic, which is Ribena and lemon juice.
Like just straight lemon juice?
Well, it's not straight lemon juice. It's diluted. It's mixed into the thing, but basically black currant and lemon juice.
That's
I've heard. Yeah, I was just gonna say I've heard British people on TikTok talk about Ribena. What is Ribena?
It's essentially it's basically just blackcurrant juice, but concentrated, and then you can either get it sort of pre-mixed or you get a bottle of concentrate and then stir that in.
And it's a Chinese import.
No, it's a Hong Kong import from Britain.
Oh, okay. Hong Kong.
The one story I will share about Ribena is that I lived in London when I was doing my PhD work, and I did some work at the British Library. And so I saw people drinking Ribena. I had never heard of it before. And I bought some Ribena to try. And it was a bottle of concentrate. And I didn't know it was concentrate.
Oh.
It was not good. It was not good.
Oh no.
Yeah, one of my housemates is Canadian, and he had not encountered Ribena before, and he very nearly drank a shot of straight Ribena until a friend of mine who was looking over my shoulder said, "Wait, don't do." I wish they hadn't said that. I just would have. It
It
would
would
have
have
been a
been.
once in a lifetime experience for both of us. A, him doing it, and B, me seeing the look on his face. But
I
tragic.
mean, what other joy is there than watching somebody else, suffer a small indignity
exactly.
like that? So exactly. So, PH, what are you drinking tonight?
I have Chinchilla. It is a Imperial Nitro Stout from Commonwealth Brewery, a little ways down the road in Hampton Roads area of Virginia. Hazelnuts, cocoa nibs, and lactose. It also clocks in at 11.2%. I did promise on Twitter that I would drink something really fucking strong tonight, so I'm living up to it.
That's a tall can too. So
Yeah.
that's a lot of 11%
It's a tall
right
boy.
there. There you
Yeah,
go.
and
Excellent.
it is really good.
I have to say, I think of all of your colleagues, you understand the show better than them.
I did my homework.
There
This
you
is the
go.
only homework I
Okay.
did. To be
Okay.
clear, this is the only homework I did, but I did my homework.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So how about you, Varsha? What are you drinking tonight?
I'm having in honor of, what I sort of thought of the historians on Reddit would be like. They're like Rough Riders. It's called, it's a rye whiskey. The brand is Rough Rider, and it's called the Big Stick. And the reason it's called the Big Stick is because it's cask strength, and it's 60.5% alcohol, so it's 121 proof. And it's a rye, so it's really spicy. But the thing is, it's a lot warmer than most of my ryes. It's not as spicy, so I like this one a lot.
I thought the reason you said it, you were going to say that it was called the Big Stick was because of Teddy Roosevelt, but
Oh yeah, it is. It is like there's a Teddy Roosevelt picture on it somewhere, or
Oh,
there
no.
was. But yeah, no, it is Teddy Roosevelt on a horse.
okay.
But that's definitely why they named it. It's 1898 Roosevelt, a native Long Islander, organized the United States' first volunteer cavalry, and it has the quote "Speak softly and carry a big stick." I don't think this distillery has really interrogated the imperialistic issues with that quote. I don't think most of America has really.
Yeah.
Yeah, they probably chose it because it was neat.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I chose it. So
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I myself tonight, I'm drinking
What about
some bourbon. I have some Woodford Double Oaked, which is just really lovely and smooth. But my backup drink, which is more interesting, is this stuff called oops, I'm turning it the wrong way. Brennivin, which is an Icelandic liqueur. It tastes like you would think an Icelandic liqueur would taste like. But in a good way, I want to say, not like fermented shark or something like that, which they do eat. But it's very anisey and very subtle, so it's a really nice kind of smooth drink to have in the evening, which I would say it is right here. So with that out of the way, I think the question that I wanted to ask you guys first is, what is the weirdest thing you've had to deal with as mods? Because I think if anybody knows anything about Reddit, it's just like, it is a little bit of the Wild West, in which there's a lot of stuff that happens. And one of the things that's really amazing about Ask Historians is, if you visit the subreddit, is that it keeps it very civil, it keeps it very serious. But I'm sure that it's not always been that way. So what stories do you have?
The one that comes to mind first is that we have a user who we banned because they were inappropriate, or I don't know what they did, but I think like every 6 months they show back up in mod mail and throw insults at us and be like, okay, ban me again, because we can mute people who we ban, but like clockwork, this person just keeps showing up and yelling at us. And I just think that's kind of funny. Like, the level of commitment is almost impressive.
you've made it when you have haters, like dedicated haters.
Yeah.
you
So
know?
I had a user who made a user. So my username is Georgi K. Zukov. Someone made Zukov is a CUNT, and they would just started posting in the subreddit, and then they started mod mailing, and they started DMing, and they kept it up for a couple weeks. We banned them from the sub, but they kept it up until the admins finally kicked them out. But yeah, we can get some real crazies.
Yeah.
For a while, I like to say, oh, I'm relatively new on the moderator team. I don't remember the bad old days, but I realized about 3 days ago that I've been here for nearly 4 years. So I don't have this excuse anymore. So I do have to come up with something. In terms of weird stuff, I mean, there's bad stuff and there's weird stuff. I think, I don't know, I feel like one of the weirder things is the people who think that they can try and write an answer with an AI program and we won't notice.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's
And
amazing.
the worst of all is when they include sources, because the AI will make up books that don't exist,
Yeah.
which immediately is worse of a giveaway than if they'd not done that to begin with. Because we don't have a preemptive sourcing policy. We say, look, if you're doing it from memory, that's fine. But if someone asks, you do have to provide sources in a reasonable time frame. So a lot of answers will not necessarily have sources right off the bat. But which means that, yeah, when you have an AI answer where they go, so here is this person who wrote this book in this year, and you go, no, that this person did not write this book and didn't in fact write a book in that year at all because they were already dead for 20 years. Which did
But
happen.
I just really want to be in
yeah.
the mind of the person who thinks, yeah, I'm gonna make up an answer
Yeah.
for a Reddit post. I'm sorry.
I mean,
I understand wanting to answer questions, but to go to that extent, because you don't get paid. It's not like you're the professor of Reddit University. I
Yeah.
just that's weird.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the big thing that we've noticed, like, especially in that first uptick when we started getting a ton of AI answers, is so many people are fucking idiots about what the chat GPT bots actually are. They think that they think they're actually intelligent. They don't realize that it's not actually writing an answer. It's just creating predictive text based on putting
Yeah.
together a bunch of things. And it is so hilariously wrong on even the most basic facts. And then so we'll ban them. And then we are arguing with these people who are insisting that the AI can't be wrong, that it must, that it's the future and it's going to put us all out of jobs in 5 years, as if they do they not realize that it literally needs our books to be able
Yeah.
to function in the first place?
To give an example
Like,
of how that works in action, there was this really big answer that I think we briefly said, oh, this might be good enough to tweet. And I looked at it and thought, wait, no, the writing style feels really waffly and really unspecific. And then I looked at the sources and basically the authors didn't match the books in about a third of the cases. The funniest example was, in fact, the first book on the source list, which was something like The Italian Wars, 1494 to 1556, which I think is the right date for the Italian Wars, by some guy. And I looked up some guy, and I Googled some guy, The Italian Wars. And no, this is a guy who wrote a book called Italy and the Great War, i.e. World War I. But the AI thought, oh, clearly this guy writes about Italy and war, therefore the early modern Italian wars, he must have written a book about them.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. I mean, like this is obviously something that we're all confronting. Those of us who are in classrooms, right? Is this AI predictive text? Like, are you like this engagement or this mode of engaging that you're seeing like on the subreddit? Like, is this analogous? Like, if you guys are in classrooms at all to what you see with like kind of quote unquote in real life, or is it something? Do you think it's something different going on?
So, I mean, I'm not a professor. A number of the mods on the team are instructors in some way, shape, or form, though, and they've all been seeing it.
Yeah.
So, it's, I think Kyle said he saw like 20% of papers that he got for one assignment were obviously people doing ChatGPT, and there's probably at least a couple percent who were smart enough to at least do some basic edits so it wasn't obvious. It's a serious issue as far as I can tell in academia.
Yeah.
Students,
I got a few this semester.
they're idiots. They
It's
don't
scary.
understand what it does and how easy it is to find it.
Yeah, I got a few this semester. I think the only way I sort of dealt with this, I sort of just talked to student one-on-one, being like, hey, do you want to maybe redo this assignment in your own words? And we just didn't have to say what we knew what was going on, and they did it. So yeah, I think that the reason it's frustrating is because it greatly misunderstands the purpose of quote unquote AI. Because the thing that really bugs me, just really gets me in my head, is that's not AI. Okay, it is a collection service that has collated a bunch of information that it might have access to, and it doesn't have the best regurgitation whatever method, and so it's not actually AI. Don't do it. But the thing is, it is really useful for people who are like in the more STEM fields. They're learning how to code with AI, and that's really cool because the answers there are much more standardized in most cases, right? And it's the same thing. Like I didn't put in my dissertation, I'm not stupid, but I just asked it about dams and India, and I felt really good about my dissertation afterwards because the essay it put out was real bad. And it also made up sources. But yeah, I think that the key thing is to really sort of, when you are trying to combat that, it's really about getting students to understand why that's not helping you and why you didn't take that class. Which is that how you sort of deal with it in Ask Historians? You sort of explain, I mean, first you delete the post, the answer, but you sort of explain why AI doesn't really help.
I'll take it. So if someone posts it and they don't disclose, we ban them immediately. Off the bat, you don't get a second chance. We consider it to be plagiarism, and plagiarism is an immediate ban on our subreddit. Some people try to nitpick that and say, no, I'm not plagiarizing because a person didn't write it. We don't care. Like it's not your words. You copied the text and you pasted the text. As far as we're concerned, it is plagiarism in spirit, if not in fact. But if someone discloses it, then we will usually post something and be like, hey, this is not okay. This is why you shouldn't be doing this. We've had a couple of meta threads where we've discussed it, and some of our flared contributors have broken down why this, like they'll put in a prompt and have it spit it out, and then they'll analyze like, why is this so terrible? So we have tried to be instructive, as long as people are doing it in misplaced good faith. But
we have a nice kind of a check and balance in our system. We have 4 kind of general questions we ask users to keep in mind before answering a question. And one of them is you have to be able to answer follow-up questions. So if you are posting a ChatGPT answer, that means you cannot answer follow-up questions. And I think there's like 35 of us, 35 moderators, I think.
I think we're over 40, but about 30 active at any given time.
Yeah, so amongst the 30 of us, and just to clarify, and I always, it's not imposter syndrome, but some of us are not formal historians. Jeremy is a formal historian, he's studying history. PH and I, we are, I don't even know what noun to use there, nerds about a particular historical area.
You're public historians.
Yeah.
You're still historians.
We have to prove.
I don't get the term.
Yeah. We have to prove our bona fides. And what that means is if somebody says, if I write an answer about the history of education in America and someone says, how do you know this? What are your sources? I have to be able to provide those sources. I have to be able to answer follow-up questions, provide sources, be up to date on academic research. And what's the 4th question? What am I blanking on?
Research, follow-ups, sources. I don't remember what the 4th question is.
Something else like
respectful.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm halfway through this. Don't ask me.
So we have a nice check and balance. If you just think you can drop an answer and run, it's not going to fly. We'll catch on to you, and either like PH said, we'll either ban you or we'll scold you and put you on warning.
Yeah.
So I have a question, because I don't use Reddit as often as other people in this interview. How sort of the history of Ask Historians, how did Ask Historians begin? Like, how did the subreddit begin? I don't know if anybody knows.
I guess this is me. I am the longest tenured mod on this call, and I'm now the 3rd longest tenured mod, period. No, 4th. It's been a long time. So originally, Ask Historians was founded by a high school student who just decided that he was going to make a subreddit called Ask Historians, and that for the first couple months, that was it was just this. It was art running the subreddit, and people would post answers, and he would. So as most people know, we have flared contributors, which represent expertise, but he would just give flair to anyone who said, yes, I know things about this topic. You didn't need to prove it. You didn't need to have a history of answers. You didn't need anything. He eventually added a couple extra mods who joined the team. They kind of made things a little better. They started adding rules. They started being like, hey, if this is Ask Historians, we need to live up to the name. So we got some very basic rule sets going. The big turning point, which was, I want to say about 6 months before I joined the mod team, was there was an AMA with allegedly with an historian who had reached out and said, hey, I want to host an AMA. And it turned out that it was a job done by another subreddit called Game of Trolls. They had faked that they were this historian. They got permission to post it. And then they started just getting progressively weirder and stupider and more offensive in the answers until finally it was like, no, this is clearly not who they. It was a big reckoning, some meta threads like, hey, has this subreddit being run correctly? And at that point, that's when we really decided, hey, we need to take this seriously. We need to form this into a space where it's not academic per se, but we at least try to keep a certain level of expertise required to post, a certain
Mhm.
level of decorum to participate, and try to make it a space that if people know things, they're going to want to post there and they're going to feel that it is worth their time to do so. And from that point on, the ways that we've developed our rules have been very much aimed at how do we attract people to this space and make it a place where an expert feels that their contributions are valuable. And the rest is history. Well, not yet history, hopefully.
The rest is still within the bounds of the 20-year rule, and that's not eligible to
Yeah,
be
that's
on.
not allowed.
Yes.
Go ahead, Varsha, please.
Oh, I was just gonna say, this is really interesting. I was gonna make a joke about maybe there was a coup at some point, but obviously it was a very respectful
not quite.
transfer of power. But so if somebody, who's watching this, or maybe somebody who's never used Reddit before, or a grad student who's never gotten to take more than one class in a certain field, wanted to go to Reddit, the subreddit, and they were just asked the question, why exactly did we leave, the Articles of Confederation? A historian, or maybe not a historian, but somebody would try to answer, and there'd be a bunch of different answers. And you guys as moderators would choose, or not choose, but basically take off answers that are not as supported as the others. And then it turns into a larger discussion. So it's basically like a mini seminar for each subreddit. That's so cool.
We do kind of limit discussion a little bit.
Okay.
It's one of the tensions of the way we operate. It's the benefit of it outweighs the negatives. We do allow discussion. If you ask a question and someone answers you, you are welcome to talk to that person. You can ask follow-up questions, you can ask about sources, you can talk to that person, but we do not allow people debating the question with each other inside the thread.
That makes a lot of sense.
I mean, a lot of people who push back against that, they're like, they want the whole like wisdom of the crowd thing. They think, hey, if I post this a little bit, I know, someone else will add on what they know, and eventually you're going to get the entire answer. Aside from the fact that that actually isn't true,
It's monkeys and typewriters.
that just it goes against our basic philosophy. Like we don't want little pieces here and there. We want someone, again, comes back, we want someone to feel that they can spend the time writing for an hour, for 2 hours, and give a really solid answer.
Wow, that's a lot of fun.
So I'm curious too. I mean, like, so one of the things that I benefited from, and I know a little bit about, is the AMAs that you guys host with authors of works, or with specialists or something like that. And the reason that I'm thinking about that too, especially, is that I don't know if you guys have seen, is that the American Historical Association just very recently put out a guideline about kind of public scholarship and kind of a way of trying to get at least academic departments to think about the way that history is done and what kind of counts as history. And it's actually really good. It's extraordinarily expansive, and it says that scholarship does not occur just in peer-reviewed publications, not just in elite journals or academic monographs, but it occurs in venues like Ask Historians, in which you're using your expertise in order to engage any sort of public, be they kind of on the internet or in your classroom or kind of something like that. So like, how has, and so that leads into my question, like have you had any kind of pushback from historians that you've approached, or that have kind of talked to you about being on the subreddit, or even just kind of questioning kind of the value of that? Like, I'm hopeful that the answer is no, but I worry that the answer is yes. That makes sense.
And if it's yes, name.
That's right.
Kidding.
We're gonna
Am
drag
I
those
allowed to
fuckers.
mention that a certain person was invited on for an AMA and said, and basically simply replied implicitly with A, will I get paid? And B, you must refer to me by my knightly title?
You are welcome to, because that is, well, you stole my favorite story. Well, my least favorite story about running AMAs, but yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
Now you have to talk about
Now
it.
you have to, because that
I mean,
rules
that's
out
the law.
Yeah. I mean,
At least now I know it's not an American.
we
So
got
there
like
is an American.
it was like a 2-line response and it was like, I'm really busy. How much does this pay? Signed, Sir, which was italicized. And I am positive that is not how his normal signature is. He italicized that. And to be clear, I had addressed him as professor. I'm not going to name him, but I addressed him as professor, which I think is a perfectly respectful way to address him.
Sure, yeah.
I might have even, maybe it was doctor. I used a proper title. I'm an American. I'm not going to call you sir. And yeah, but he italicized that in his response, like, okay, this is not going the way I thought it would go.
My God, I really want to know who.
Um,
Tell me after, man.
Can you give us the vague field?
20th century, middle of the century. He likes to write about some bad people. You can take it from there. But yeah, now that Jeremy brings up, that was a fun one.
I mean,
that I think, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
It makes sorry.
I was gonna say, like, if not posed rudely, the question of compensation is an interesting question, right? But it's more
Yeah.
reserved for people who are in the contingent world of
Yeah.
academia, right? And you ask them to do unpaid labor. However, the distinct aspect of an AMA, because somebody's asked this in the questions, AMA is Ask Me Anything. The point of an AMA is also to sort of promote not just your own work, but to promote your own expertise. And so theoretically, if somebody understands how the internet works, they know that if you're talking about your own work for like an hour on an
Yeah.
online forum, somebody's going to be interested as long as you're not boring.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult question, compensation. And I know you guys aren't belittling that, but it's more like you have to address it sort of
Yeah.
calmly, especially if you're not a contingent scholar.
Yeah.
I would just say that we have zero budget whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we have maybe about $1,000 that we get from referral links and our little Patreon that mostly supports our own podcast hosting. We have enough to send. We try to send a mug. If you are on our podcast, we'll send them. Or if you're on doing AMA, we send you a mug that looks really cool and it has our logo on it. That's about the most we can afford to compensate because none of us are paid to do this. We all do this because we love it. And
I have kind of two little anecdotes to follow on from that that I will try not to make overly long. One is that a fellow moderator who was going to be on tonight, but just is very busy tomorrow morning and just couldn't be on, and is also on UK time. He uses his Ask Historians mug quite regularly, and his students noticed. And we're like, oh, I know about that. And he's going, oh, I have a friend who is also in this university who is also doing stuff. So the other little anecdote is, I mean, in drastic comparison to Professor Sir will not be named. I got one of my professors to come on the podcast just by cornering him in a pub when he'd had 2 drinks. So if you want to hear Jamie Belich talk about the Black Death, he is on the Ask Historians podcast because he got a bit drunk and I asked him and he said yes.
The one other story I would add, which is a bit more serious, and I wouldn't just in terms of like there are challenges to getting people to come on. On the plus side, I would emphasize that like we've had maybe one person ever who was on and their feedback was that they had a negative experience. Universally, people love doing our AMAs. They find it to be really enriching. It's a great way to interact with the public. We have had people turn us down. Sometimes they're very rude, such as that case. Sometimes just like, hey, I don't have the time. This was some years back, but it used to be that we would occasionally have people turn us down and they were like, Reddit, I'm not going to go on that site. The olds on here, this is before your time, Jeremy, I'm sure, will remember back when most people only knew about Reddit because Anderson Cooper did a report about it having the jailbait sub, what was that, 10, 12 years ago. That's the only thing that people knew Reddit for back then, and they didn't want to be associated with that. We haven't had that problem in a number of years, and I will also say we've had our problems with the site admins, but on the whole, they've done a very good job over the past decade trying to make the site better, make the site as a whole be more welcoming, and try and push the bad elements off. Reddit is not the same site it was 10 years ago, and that is something that we deeply appreciate from them. Whatever our complaints can have, but
that's one thing I do hear when you're sort of comparing social media, especially when new social media keeps popping up because of Twitter's fiery decline, is thinking about terms of service and conditions and how they sort of deal with that. And Reddit historically has been a lot better than that. Again, it all depends on which subreddit you're on. I think based on the conversation we had already, my main question now is, what is the most interesting thing you've learned from your time as a moderator on Ask Reddit? Like, do you have one question that you think about at night and the answer?
Oh, that's interesting.
You have to choose one. But
I mean, I have recency bias, but I'm still kind of delighted and happy that somebody had a misperception about breastfeeding in the antebellum South, and they reached out to us and they asked a question and they said, here's something I don't understand, help me understand this. And I think we were able to help them. And so it just happened like 2 days ago. PH and I both were able to give them some kind of context about it. And it was, I think what makes me, what it's going to stick with me is that somebody was wondering about something, they revealed a discomfort with a topic, and they got an answer from someone on Reddit that they could trust. And I think that's kind of cool.
Was it about enslaved women and wet nursing?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
the
that's a
whole-
really difficult topic.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of, at least when I teach the US survey, when we get to that, especially if you're reading certain books with undergrads, a lot of undergrads, you know, their Bible is not really well developed in high school. They're not fully understanding the details of breastfeeding and high school biology. And so the major question I get is, wait, how can you be a wet nurse if you're not pregnant? And I'm like, well, actually, you do have to be. And there's a lot of other things that go on. Yeah, but that's a really difficult topic. It's really cool that they sort of got their answer.
Yeah.
Got their question answered.
Yeah.
What about you guys? What about you, Jeremy?
If we're talking specifically about questions, I mean, there are some people who like to ask some really specific questions to which there are not already good answers. Sometimes there's just not much I can do about that. You know, there's one question about, you know, how historically have Muslims in Imperial China, or did Muslims in Imperial China, reconcile their faith with the notion of the emperor as the son of heaven? No, there's not really a lot that's written on Chinese Muslims in general, and especially not on the reconciliation of faith and politics in that regard. But people are evidently interested in this question from a lay standpoint. It's just, as far as I know, nobody's written about it. But if it's about my particular specialism, which is the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, I have a lot of easy access to a lot of sources. And so if nobody seems to have written much on the topic, I might be able to do something original. So my undergraduate thesis was based on someone asking, so the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is started by a guy called Hong Xiuqian, who had a series of visions which he later interpreted as religious revelations that led him to believe that he was the son of God and the Abrahamic God specifically.
Wow.
And he was supposed to revive the worship of God in pagan China. And someone asked, what did he actually see in his visions? And it turns out the answer is, ooh. The story gets more elaborate the later you go, which is always one of those fun situations where, the more detailed, the more dubious. And so what I had originally written was, okay, here's a few key sources that people seem to point to. And then eventually my undergrad thesis was, let's look at just the visions as they are described across as much of the corpus of sources as possible. That I think is probably the question that has stuck with me the most, because it genuinely influenced my actual research at one stage.
Wow, that's so cool. A Reddit post helped inspire part of your undergrad thesis. That's amazing. I mean, it's
You say part of it was the whole thing. Basically.
I mean, it's the same thing happened to me. It wasn't a Reddit post, but it was one of my TAs for an undergrad US history class. He was British, and it was my freshman year, and he was talking about the French and Indian War, and he was like, yeah, I never learned about this in high school. I don't think he said high school. He said the British word for high school. Maybe he said high school. Like, what do you mean you never learned about the French and Indian War? I was like, what are you talking about? What did you learn about then? And he like went over what he learned about specifically British history, and most of it sort of just skipped over the 19th century and empire. And I was like, you didn't learn about the empire? And he's like, well, not really. And I was hooked. 3 years later, that's what I'm writing my undergrad thesis on. Yeah. What about you? Were there interesting questions about dueling, PH, that like really got you?
There definitely are. I mean, the thing I would emphasize that Jeremy already brought up, and also just trying to sell Ask Historians as much as I can. One of the things that really I think is its strong point is because the questions are coming from the public, because they're coming from people who don't necessarily have a good grasp of the topic. They often ask questions in a way that engages with the topic in a way that historians don't always think of it. So they're making connections that we don't usually make necessarily, or which might reflect current historical trends, but no one's written on it yet. So there just aren't good sources that look at that. Sometimes that results in very, very bad questions, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it results in really cool questions that you have to put a lot of thought to. And the only way to answer it is to basically do original research. And it really helps all of us think about our subject matter in new ways and think about how can we make our subject matter more relevant to people who actually want to learn about it, as opposed to how academics might talk about the subject between themselves. As far as questions that I've gotten, I think the one that was the most interesting to answer and most fun to write about was probably about a year or two ago. Someone asked about how dueling and disability intersect.
I was just thinking of that question.
Yeah.
That's so
It's one of my
cool.
favorite things I've ever written on the subreddit, because there is not a single freaking source out there that writes on that topic. There's sources that touch on it in some way, shape, or form, and there's primary sources that you can look at and kind of pull things out of, but there's no one who's written a book that's dueling and disability. Disability, obviously, it's kind of a popular thing to use as a lens of analysis these days, but dueling is a it's a very small
manly
scholars.
thing.
There's like 5 or 6 scholars who have written anything that are currently active these days, and none of them have done disability as their focus. So I had to spend the better part of a day going through every book I had in my library, trying to figure out how to connect this topic together and look at dueling as a whole and how did it intersect with disability. And I mean, I think that I put together a pretty good presentation and a thesis based on how dueling and disability, because dueling is so much about masculinity, there were exceptions made for disabilities that often would be found in how a man might be injured in wartime. All of the ways that I could find accommodations, all of them were things that you might expect someone to be injured in war. Losing a leg, losing an arm, losing an eye, all of those you can find examples of accommodations. There's no accommodations for anything else, though. You can't find
Two
accommodations
things.
for intellectual disabilities. You can't find things for like a hunchback or some sort of congenital disability. So I was able to write something looking at how dueling and masculinity intertwined with disability, and I was really happy with what that did. And there's nothing out there. If I were to work on putting something to publish out of everything I've ever written on Ask Historians, that would be it. I think that there's a lot more to explore there. I know other sources I could look at for it. And coming back to what I said, like, no one's written on that. And someone asked that question and I had to think about it, and I had no guidance, and it was really, really fun to try and figure out how to write an answer for that question.
Yeah. My 2 follow-ups are one, as soon as I asked about dueling and then he started talking about it, I immediately obviously thought of Hamilton. And I wonder, and my first question is, did a lot of people using Ask Historians, were they affected by Hamilton's sort of resurgence in the musical scene? And were they also affected by, or do you see a lot of affection of like the modern use of history musicals like Book of Mormon or the 7 Wives of Henry? Is it the 7 Wives or some wives of Henry VIII?
6 wives. I think
right?
it's
Yeah,
Yeah, it was just
ex-wives
6,
of
don't worry.
Henry. And my the question I had, sorry, there's a third question in there. Did women duel? That's just a specific question for you. Was that
Okay.
a disability?
I'll take the last one first. Maybe there's a couple examples that might have been some, like there's a big famous one that supposedly was an all women's duel, and it literally erupted over an argument over flower arrangements at a big event that they were planning.
I'm obsessed.
There's
I think
and
Lifetime
they
movie.
might have dueled topless, but there's a big debate over whether that duel ever happened. When asked about it, the alleged participants denied it. So we don't really know. The big thing that I generally end up focusing on is that they didn't necessarily duel, but how they might be able to use the language of honor to their advantage, especially in 19th century France. There actually was a debate, could a woman duel? And it was never resolved. But it did, basically the result was that they might not be able to duel, but they do have honor, and they can use the language of honor and the discourse of honor, and they can be involved in an affair of honor, which a duel is part of. So they might not get to that final end, but you see examples of them using the language of the duel to humiliate men. And it can be really fun to find examples like that.
That's
I
really
cannot
cool.
take the second question. We can absolutely see the ebb and flow of pop culture. I know nothing about Red Dead Redemption, I think it is, but I know every time an expansion drops. When Assassin's Creed comes out with a new Assassin's Creed, we know.
Yeah.
We have one of our moderators is an expert in fashion and queensmanship, I think, in a particular era of fashion. So every time a question comes through for like Bridgerton drops, we're gonna get a bunch of questions about.
You're getting a lot of George III questions right now, aren't you?
Yes,
all
we've
of
got
the
George
internet
III
is-
questions. Yep.
All of the internet is obsessed with George III, and then they realize that this is George III after they finish the season, and they're like, "Wait a second, did I just stand George the goddamn third?" And they're appalled at themselves.
Yeah.
It's good they have a
But
place
who
to go to
wouldn't?
ask the question.
Who wouldn't
I
declare
would
their
be too. I've
enduring
seen
loyalty to the House of Hanover?
I've seen pictures of the actor they chose to play George III. And as a historian and a proud American who was like naturalized into the United States, if I watched that season, I would be like, oh my God, I would have issues. I would have problems. But it's interesting.
A lot of people may think Reddit is very surface level, but we just had a fascinating, we call them Monday methods, where someone writes a fairly extensive sort of in-depth piece. And one of our Flared users wrote about Cleopatra. And the question was Cleopatra Black? And so she unpacked that idea and how, and it worked incredibly hard and such a great job explaining that no, because the concept of whiteness and who is a Black person is a modern construct. And so we can't push that back. And people were trying so hard to get their heads around it. And we did have a few jerks show up. And we're not nice, but we have that ban button. We can clean things up. But it was one of those moments where you could see people who've never thought about it that way, just really trying so hard to understand. And okay, I see what you're saying, that okay, whiteness is new, and it was really a fascinating thing to watch. And that was all because of Cleopatra on Netflix.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that because you talked about banning people and dealing with people who are jerks a couple times. And the sweatshirt behind you, I see, says protect trans kids. And a real important trend that's going on around TikTok right now is people are talking about trans history, because the common fallacy that people who are anti-trans will use being like, oh, it's just popped up in the past like 20 years or so, or the 5 years, everyone's deciding they're trans. And like a couple of people have sort of broken down that the history of trans people has gone back centuries, if not millennia. So have you gotten interesting questions about that since the recent uproar about drag and trans and gay rights?
We actually had an entire panel at our 2021 conference.
Yeah, it was the last conference that we did.
Yeah, our last conference about trans history. And people who existed outside of the gender binary. And we are actually going to be doing on, I think it's trans visibility in June. Maybe Trans Remembrance Day in June. One of our mods is currently facilitating the creation of a methods thread, a big thread pulling together a bunch of trans history. So we do get questions, and we do get a lot of times, were there other societies? And we get a lot of questions about homosexuality in Greece. And that comes up a lot, like the same way Hitler does. Like people find like this way to get into history. And so it's like gay people.
You guys in the History Channel, right? You guys in the History Channel. Yeah.
Has anybody asked this? Actually, if you know the answer, that would be great. Because a couple of TikTok historians have made funny videos about it. Has anybody asked if Lincoln is gay? Do you have a definitive answer? Because I don't go on Reddit. Was Lincoln gay? Because it's a common theory among
I'm not
people who are
sure
not
if we've ever
historians.
seen that question. I mean, I've heard that rumor before. I don't think it's very well substantiated, but I've heard it.
It's not.
We
It's
got
sad though.
Was Lincoln, did Lincoln have a disability? And we get was
Oh.
he's so autistic a lot, which I think comes from TikTok.
I think everyone agrees James Buchanan was gay.
Ooh. Did not know that.
I half wonder if possibly one of the reasons that Reddit and TikTok that we don't get a lot of TikTok related stuff is that there's not a lot of strong overlap.
Okay.
I
Well,
do genuinely wonder if, because Reddit is not exactly known for a consistently pro-Chinese bent. And that does, I think that does go backward to a lot of people, including myself, do not trust TikTok as a platform.
That makes a lot of sense though, because there's a lot of issues with TikTok.
Yeah, and I
but
know
it's
there's a couple of moderators who, not to give too much away, I mean, his partner looked into it and was like, this is obviously Chinese spyware disguised as a social media site. And that does, I think, put certain people off, and I think Redditors especially so. And it wouldn't surprise me if they were somewhat insulated, or at least one level away from TikTok trends.
to be clear, I'm not getting my answers from TikTok. I do have some
God.
self-respect. It's more that I'm interested in what like the
Hmm.
public questions, and they have like this is also true of Twitter though, like the common theme of a historian saying, and then they were just best friends when they're talking about like same-sex relationships, you know, romantic or otherwise. And do you get a lot of questions around that, around sexuality now that Pride is sort of coming up?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, and again, it's one of those classic issues where, again, like it was Cleopatra Black, you have to kind of go, like, both sides are slightly wrong here. At the very least, like, saying is someone gay only makes sense in a heteronormative modern context.
Mm.
But the reason it doesn't apply in the past is also because what is normative in the past was also different. So you can't. It's one of those things where, I mean, this happens with a lot of questions. You have to thread the needle between not saying that the modern state of things is inherently normative, while also, and
Yeah.
I mean, that leads into like a great question the audience sort of had. Rich sort of asked, based on your experience as moderators, what's the biggest misunderstanding an American might have had about our history? Mainly because American history and the history of the United States is in big debate in recent times.
Do I have
Critical
to
race
choose
theory.
one?
You don't have to choose. Choose the one that
you
you
can
think
get
might be the most
mine.
egregious.
For what it's worth, I have never even stepped foot in the Western Hemisphere, so
Even the Western Hemisphere goes through England. Sure, you've been on that side of it.
that is
It's
true.
like-
I am
it cuts
technically
through
in the Western
London. Have you been
Hemisphere
on that
as
side
we
of
speak.
London?
I am in the Western Hemisphere as we speak. That is
Gotcha.
technically
Okay.
true. I have
I
not set
nailed it.
foot in the New World unless you count
Hmm.
Australia.
Man, I'm
Well, I have to start
Third.
all of my answers about American education with the same line. There is no such thing as the American education system. We don't have an American education system. We have 56 different education systems that all, yes, they're all continentally in America, but
Apart from Hawaii.
apart from Hawaii. And so one of the things I have to help people understand is that when they ask questions about American education, I have to first say, okay, the experience in Texas is very different than the experience in New York, except there are some commonalities. And so a lot of times we just have to clarify that the American experience is very, very different depending on class and race and gender and in geography. And I think helping people understand that is a huge step towards helping them better understand American history, the scope and the diversity of that history.
I never thought about it that way. Because I mean, obviously I know that we have the federal system for a reason. And I know that my experience learning history in Wisconsin was very different than in California, but I never put two and two together. That is fascinating. Is that where a lot of it stems from when they're asking about questions of American history? You can sort of see maybe where they learned their high school history and they're sort of.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people feel that there should be more boxes. So for example, a common question is, what happened to Asian people during the Civil Rights Movement? Where would they sit on the bus? And you could see exactly where that question's coming from. They're trying to understand how were Asian people classified in terms of where they would literally sit on the bus. And so I think, our responsibility, and thankfully everyone who is a Flare user or a moderator, or even people who aren't Flared who answer, have recognized the earnestness and the innocence or naivety that comes in that question. Like you can tell when a question comes from a place of, I've thought about this, I don't get it, help me understand, from I'm just going to ask a question to be a jerk. And we use the phrase jagging off when people ask questions, and you know what they're doing and you can tell. And PH and Jeremy both great at it. They can recognize right away, this person is just asking a question just to be a jerkhead.
Yeah.
Just
But
to
that's
clarify,
the answer to
jacking
that
off
is
spelled.
fascinating.
Just to clarify, jacking off is spelled JAQing off for just asking questions.
It's funny.
That is important to clarify, I think.
Yes.
That's an important clarification.
But
Yeah.
I recently read an article about this, about how technically, depending on which part of Asia you were from, you might have been classified as white at certain points, and Indians specifically were interested in being classified as white. And so that's my last. And then Matt, I promise you can wrap up after this. The common answer that I happen to get a lot when I was an undergrad and even now, and I give this answer now, is a historian will start an answer with, it's complicated. It literally was like the catchphrase in my head of like every historian that I knew, and it might be my catchphrase today. How do you find that the people who are answering questions have an easier time dealing with that now that they are sort of experienced? Like they are able to like give a quick 1-paragraph answer to that question without falling into the trap of, well,
I mean, we like it when they fall into the trap and do well. We want people to like get into the nitty gritty and go as deep as they can. So I mean, we don't mind that, to be sure.
you're enabling them. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'd also say, and just building a little off what Jen said, is that and also to answer the question that I think Richard was what you said his name was, there's always this tension of, especially with American history, of people asking, why didn't I learn about this in school? And the tension is half the time the answer, like they always want it to be some conspiracy about like suppressing of the truth. And at least half the time, if not more, it's actually your curriculum is only so many days long. They can only focus on so many things, and they have to choose what to teach you and what not to teach you. And the answer is usually much less interesting. Just, hey, if they're teaching you about the age of imperialism in America, they're not going to teach you about the invasion of Cuba. They're not going to teach you about the Banana Wars and the Philippines. They're going to choose one of those. They're not hiding the Philippines from you. No, they just decided to teach you about Cuba.
Yeah.
But
That's my other big pet peeve related to that is when somebody on any social media post will be like, historians don't talk about this,
Yeah.
but then their sources are historians. It really gets my goat. No hate to them, but I'm just like, because journalists do this too, and journalists, I mean, like they'll do this too, and so yeah.
Burberry pirates.
Yeah.
The number of times people have posted about, why don't people talk about Burberry pirates and the
because
Burberry
no
slaves?
one cares.
So I
Gives a
want to tack on to PH's point there, because this turns out I do have something to say about misconceptions about American history in a very roundabout way.
Bring it.
Which is a question that we get a lot by my standards is, why don't people talk about the Taiping Rebellion more? And they will often explicitly compare it to the American Civil War. They will say they happened around the same time. In fact, Taiping started earlier. And they will talk about, oh, the Taiping Rebellion killed 20 million people or something. The American Civil War killed something like 1.5. You know, why didn't I learn more about that? And in a sense, it kind of speaks to the difference between historians and lay people at this point, that I will look at this and go, having gone to school in America, do you think there are maybe reasons why you learned about more things that happened in America than happened in other parts of the world?
Yeah.
And it's also a thing of, I think almost, it's slightly voyeuristic, the idea that because a lot of people died, it should be more important. It's not to say that it's not important even though people died, but it is to say the number of people who died may not be as important as where do its legacies lie in the place where you actually learn about it. Because ultimately, history as taught is still mostly national history, even if it's not necessarily the history of the nation state from beginning to end. It is still like, what topics you even talk about ultimately comes back to some extent to the idea of what does the curriculum want you to get out of it, in part from a very national perspective. And that's true of the Taiping. I mean, it's only in the last 11 years that we've seen anyone really engage with the Taiping as a global phenomenon. And again, global history as a field isn't the sort of thing that supports or expands upon national histories. It's, if anything, diametrically opposed to it. And so you're not going to see national curricula take lots of lessons from global history.
And I think that also ties to the other side of that tension, because yes, we're not hiding all these things from you, not teaching them, but there is a triumphalist narrative of American history that you're going to learn in school.
Of course.
I think we look at the kerfuffle, that, putting it mildly, that came up about the 1619 project over the past couple of years, and people so up in arms about the fact that it was presenting pretty non-controversial.
It's not at all controversial. That's my biggest
in academic history. And they focus on one minor error in the introductory essay that needed one word of qualification to make it be perfectly fine. And they decide that that takes the entire project down. And because no one is willing to engage with the broader picture of it, because they don't want to confront that narrative of history that they had. The 1619 project, it's great. like, do I have my minor nitpicks here and there? Sure, I think everyone does, including probably the authors. Like, shit, did I really put it that way? Maybe I should. But no, it's great. But you have that tension. People learn this in school, and they don't want to have that challenged.
Yeah,
Um,
and part of that, I think that's in some ways a nice way to kind of wrap up here, because I think that illustrates as well the 1619 project. It illustrates the tension of kind of an elitism which still pervades, unfortunately, the discipline of history. Right, is that part of the critique was always about elite, predominantly Ivy League white male historians saying, like, you're not authorized to speak about American history in a way that's different from me, from the narrative that I and my colleagues have created. Right. And that's one of the really wonderful things about kind of Ask Historians, and especially really, I think really great that the American Historical Association is kind of going in that direction of saying, like, no, history is done in lots of different ways by lots of different people. And, we were talking earlier, like, Jen, you were trying to not qualify yourself as a historian, but like, you're a historian. Like, if you deal ethically with the past, as far as we should be concerned, like, you are a historian. And so the stuff that you guys do on every day, reaching literally hundreds of thousands of people, like, that's good history. Like, and that there needs to be kind of more of it. I saw some people in the Q&A saying, like, I have to go join Reddit now. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but you should join the Ask Historian subreddit. Absolutely 100% and do that.
I have a
tonight,
Reddit just for Korean drama recommendations. So I'll just use my account and just jump to the other subreddit because I'm fascinated now. I don't know if anybody follows me on Twitter. I recently met a really cool historian at Stanford, just on a day trip to Stanford. I was visiting a friend, and it was after this workshop, and I come up to him just to introduce myself, and he goes, "You're the hot damn historian, right?" And in my head, I'm losing my mind. And he's like, "Yeah, we corresponded earlier about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution." I was like, "Why do you remember that? That's weird." But I had a really great conversation with him. But now I'm interested in seeing what historians around the world have to say about that question because it bugs me.
So I would want to just jump in one quick note before everyone else says their final bits too. Obviously, we want as many people to join Ask Historians as possible. We want to welcome as many people into the community as possible. We think it is a great community, and it is one of the best tools out there for someone who wants to practice history in a public way. There is a learning curve, though. And the one thing we always make sure to tell people is don't think that you can just jump in and start answering questions. We've had people with PhDs show up and they've written shit answers. Shit answers.
Yeah.
We don't care what your credentials are nearly as much as we care that your answers speak for themselves. And this, obviously, when you show up, please make sure to read the rules before you try posting. But the single biggest piece of advice I tell every single person who says, "Hey, I think I might try answering questions," is make sure that when you write your answer, you take a big step back and you think about, hey, I like what I wrote, but is someone who doesn't know anything about this topic, if they read that, are they going to feel that I am speaking to them in a way that shows I know what I'm talking about, and that answered the question in a way that someone who's completely ignorant does? Because that's how we're going to evaluate it, and that's how we're going to moderate it.
Yeah.
So you might be right, but if it's just like 3 sentences and you're just like, I know what I'm talking about, I have a PhD in this, we don't care. We want you to show why you're right, not that you are right.
Pretend you're in comps and your advisor has asked you, "Hey, listen,
Bingo.
What caused the Civil War?" And you're not going to be like, "Yeah, the Civil War, slavery," and then you're not going to drop your mic.
Yeah.
Right? I love that. I love that. Being a part of this means I have to live through comps every day.
Yes, exactly.
I'm signing up.
And to give you another nice analogy, I like to compare being a mod to being a TA. We don't, and like, let's say I'm doing my dissertation, I don't know, like 19th century French art. So I'm in the art department and they put me as a TA on like ancient Ming art or whatever the fuck the Chinese dynasty was then. Jeremy, I can see your face. Hi, Jeremy. But I mean, it is. I don't know shit about China. I just said the Ming are ancient. I think they're actually like what, 1600s, give or take.
They're early modern. They're
Cool.
1368.
That's exactly my point. I don't know anything about the topic, but I do have tools as an historian to evaluate how people are making arguments. How are they using sources? How are they constructing this? Does what they said make sense? As mods, that's what we have to do. We don't know the nitty gritty of everything you're talking about. We know that you're constructing an argument and we are evaluating how you're constructing that argument.
Yeah.
I
So-
love that.
So,
Yeah, think
That's great.
about us as your TA, and you need to make sure that even if we're an idiot, we still get that you know what you're talking about.
but the great thing about that analogy is that the best TAs are invite you into the topic and you
Yes.
learn together. And so I invite everybody out there, if you're still with us, go join Ask Historians as soon as possible. Maybe you'll see some of these guys. Very quickly, can you guys share your Reddit handles so people can look for you online?
Sure, I'm Ed History 101. So Education History 101 at History 101. And I want to just quick raise my empty glass to the person who worked up their courage to ask the question, did anyone go to the top of Mount Olympus and look around? Which I think is such a wonderful question. And the day that question came up, I thought, props to you, friend, for asking that question.
Excellent. So, Jeremy?
So I am Enclaved Microstate, which is slightly hard to spell. Enclaved, ENCLAVED, Microstate, MICROSTATE.
Excellent.
Written at a time in my teenage years when I was utterly obsessed with San Marino. And I'm still very sad that they did not make it to the Eurovision finals.
One of those things. PH.
And I am Georgi K. Zukov.
Excellent. So go look for everybody online. And until then, thank you everybody for joining us, Jen, Jeremy, PH. This has been a really wonderful hour, and just lots of great conversations here, and lots more to come, I think, in the subreddit going forward. So hopefully lots of new yes, lots of new members hopefully going forward. So thank you all, everybody. Enjoy your evening wherever you are, and until the next time we see you, cheers.
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 Cheers.